You know the story they always tell you. Kings were monsters. Tyrants conducted sick experiments on their subjects. Torture chambers. Mass suffering. Born from absolute power. We've heard it 1,000 times, right? And sure, plenty of it was real. Horrifying, grotesque, unforgivable. Here's the part that nobody talks about. The part that makes the real history even more terrifying than the myths. What if I told you that some of history's most disturbing experiments, commanded by kings, weren't actually about cruelty at all? They were about something far more sinister. Something that reveals a truth about power and control that we still haven't escaped. Narrative everyone accepts is this. Kings were sadists who tortured people for entertainment or personal gain. The real horror, the one that keeps historians awake at night, is that many of history's most infamous royal experiments were conducted under the banner of something far more dangerous: legitimacy, progress, science, knowledge. These weren't just monsters indulging their whims. They were powerful men who genuinely believed they were advancing civilization, and that belief made them unstoppable. King Frederick II of Prussia. When you hear his name, you probably think of the classic tyrant narrative. The experiments he commanded reveal something far more troubling than simple madness. In the 1750s, Frederick decided that understanding human nature required actual experiments, not for torture, not for sadism, but to answer a genuine philosophical question that was keeping European intellectuals awake. What is our true, natural language? If you raised a child in total isolation, never speaking to them, what language would they spontaneously speak? Would it be Hebrew, Greek, some primordial tongue? Frederick wasn't asking this question because he enjoyed cruelty, asking it because the entire Enlightenment was obsessed with understanding human nature in its purest form. And he had power, he had resources, the authority to command people's lives. So he did what made logical sense to him. He conducted the experiment, he took infants. He gave them to nurses who were sworn to complete silence, no language, no communication, nothing but basic care. He watched to see what would happen. What happened? Most of the children died. Those who survived never developed language at all. They communicated in basic sounds and gestures. Frederick's experiment didn't advance human knowledge the way he hoped. But here's what's crucial. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone for the sake of it, trying to prove something about the nature of humanity itself. He just had absolute power and no ethical framework to stop him. Is where it gets truly dark, because the same logic applied across Europe. Catherine the Great of Russia was fascinated by the scientific method. She studied under the greatest minds of her era, genuinely believed in progress, enlightenment, the advancement of human civilization through reason. So when she wanted to test inoculation against smallpox, a genuinely beneficial medical procedure, she didn't test it on herself first, like some monarchs did. She tested it on prisoners and orphans. The science worked. It saved millions of lives across Europe. It was built on suffering that she authorized without hesitation because in her mind, the greater good justified it. Charles II of Spain wanted to understand heredity and bloodline. He was fascinated by inheritance, why some traits passed through families and others didn't, so he married his own niece, then his grandniece. Then he encouraged his family to continue these marriages, all in the name of understanding hereditary science. By the time his grandson was born, genetic damage was so severe that the boy couldn't chew solid food. His jaw was malformed. He was infertile. Direct result of scientific inquiry pursued by a man who had the power to command his entire family's reproductive choices. This is the angle that history classes never emphasize enough. The truly terrifying experiments weren't conducted by men who thought they were evil, were conducted by men who thought they were enlightened, men who had read the latest philosophical treatises, men who surrounded themselves with scientists and scholars, men who genuinely believed that the pursuit of knowledge justified whatever price their subjects had to pay. King Henry III of France became obsessed with dermatology, the study of skin conditions, not because he was a sadist, because he genuinely wanted to understand skin disease and find cures. So he authorized physicians in his court to deliberately infect prisoners with various diseases to study the progression of infection and recovery, documented everything meticulously. He believed he was building the foundation of modern dermatology, and in a twisted way, some of that knowledge was actually useful. but it was purchased entirely in human suffering. What makes this genuinely horrifying isn't that these were monsters acting on base impulses. What makes it horrifying is that they were exactly like us, educated, curious, invested in progress, but they had one crucial advantage: absolute power, combined with a complete absence of ethical constraints on what they could do to vulnerable people in the name of knowledge. Weren't aberrations of history. They represented something more troubling. What happens when intelligence, curiosity, power combine without conscience? They had the best books. They could talk to the smartest people of their era, believed in science and progress. They just had no legal, moral, or social structure that said no to them. Because they had no one to tell them no, they kept pushing, further, deeper, always in the service of some higher cause. True lesson of these royal experiments isn't that tyrants are evil. It's far more unsettling than that. It's that good intentions combined with unchecked power and vulnerable subjects will always result in atrocities. It's that the most dangerous people aren't the ones cackling over their cruelty. They're the ones genuinely convinced they're saving the world. Here's the part that should really disturb you. We haven't learned anything from this. Today, conducting experiments that are just as troubling, just with better PR. We're testing medicines on prisoners in developing nations. We're conducting psychological experiments on social media users without their informed consent. We're allowing pharmaceutical companies to use vulnerable populations for drug trials, justify it all the same way those kings did, in the name of progress, science, and the greater good. The only difference between King Frederick's silence experiments and the way tech companies track and manipulate children's behavior is the language we use to describe it. He called it science. We call it market research. He had absolute authority. We have terms of service that people don't read. Recorded his findings in journals. We store our data in servers, but the fundamental equation remains exactly the same. Power plus curiosity plus vulnerable subjects equals atrocities committed in the name of progress. This is the angle that historians don't emphasize. It's the angle that should terrify you. It's not the story of kings as cartoon villains. It's the story of intelligent, cultured, curious men who genuinely believed in progress and were willing to let vulnerable people suffer for it. If you think that impulse disappeared with the monarchy, you're not paying attention to what's happening right now. In the institutions you trust, companies you use, in the systems you've accepted as normal. The real horror of royal experiments isn't that kings were sadists. It's that they were exactly like the smartest, most curious, most progressive people in our own society, except they had no one to answer to. Ethics board, no legal framework, no public opinion to check their power. They just had an idea, the resources to pursue it, vulnerable people with no say in the matter. And that's why understanding their story isn't just about learning the dark past. It's about recognizing a pattern that's still alive, still active, still claiming victims in the name of the greater good. Something the history books almost never tell you. The justifications these rulers gave themselves weren't monsters who enjoyed cruelty for its own sake. They were men who believed they were solving problems, building stronger nations, advancing human knowledge. Some of the most horrific experiments in history were conducted under the banner of scientific progress, national security, or the public good. Take King Frederick II of Prussia, a man history remembers as enlightened, progressive, even a friend of philosophy. In the 1750s, he became obsessed with a question that most rulers wouldn't dare pursue publicly. What is the original language of mankind? German? Latin? Hebrew? To find out, he devised an experiment that would answer this question once and for all. Infants, newborns, and isolated them completely from human language. No speaking to them, no songs, no words. Just caretakers who fed them, bathed them, and otherwise kept absolute silence. The theory was simple. If these children were left alone to develop naturally, first language they spontaneously spoke would reveal humanity's primordial tongue. The experiment was a humanitarian catastrophe. Children didn't develop language at all. Most didn't develop normally in any sense. Some became severely mentally disabled. Some died. The ones who survived were profoundly traumatized, unable to form attachments, unable to learn social skills, unable to function as human beings should. Frederick II never publicly acknowledged the experiment. too brutal even for the standards of his time. But he didn't condemn it either. In his private writings, simply noted that the experiment had failed to produce useful results and moved on to other pursuits, is the pattern that repeats across centuries and across the entire spectrum of royal experimentation. The perpetrator believes in progress. Method is systematic. The suffering is compartmentalized, kept away from public view, away from the sympathetic gaze of those with power to stop it. And when it fails, or when it succeeds in ways that reveal its inhumanity, records are hidden, minimized, or simply filed away as regrettable but necessary sacrifices. Consider the experiments of King Charles II of Spain, a man so inbred that he couldn't close his own mouth, jaw protruded so severely that he could barely eat. Rather than accept this as a consequence of royal bloodlines marrying within themselves, physicians conducted endless, agonizing experiments trying to correct his condition. They fitted metal contraptions to his face, performed surgeries without anesthesia. They subjected him to treatments so painful that nobles would leave the room rather than witness them. None of it worked. But the experiments continued for decades because the king himself demanded them. He was willing to endure torment if it meant achieving the appearance of a normal Spanish monarch. Physicians were willing to inflict it because they were serving the king. And in the medieval and early modern mind, serving the king was the highest purpose a man could fulfill. The real darkness here isn't the physical suffering. It's the total inversion of medical ethics that allowed it to happen. A physician's job was to heal the king. The king demanded these experiments. For the experiments were healing, by definition. There was no possibility of refusal. There was no ethics committee to appeal to. There was no way out except through continued suffering. And this brings us to perhaps the most disturbing revelation about royal experimentation. The ones who conducted them weren't operating in a moral vacuum. They were operating within a system that had already defined their actions as morally acceptable. The system protected them. The hierarchy justified them. Ideology of divine right and absolute monarchy made it impossible for anyone to question them. A peasant had no right to refuse the king's will. A servant had no right to protect themselves from the king's curiosity. A child had no claim to bodily autonomy if the king decided their body could serve the advancement of knowledge. The system was designed to extract absolute obedience. Experiments were just one more way to enforce that obedience. Some historians have tried to categorize royal experiments into different types: medical, surgical, psychological, alchemical. But this categorization misses the point. Whether a king was experimenting on his subjects' bodies or their minds, whether he was trying to extend his life or create the perfect soldier, underlying structure was always the same: absolute power, zero accountability, and the complete dehumanization of the experimental subject. King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, obsessed over his health in ways that bordered on the pathological, surrounded himself with physicians and alchemists, all competing for his favor by proposing ever more elaborate medical interventions. Some of these were harmless, but others involved bizarre procedures, dangerous bloodlettings, and the consumption of mysterious substances that were more likely to poison him than heal him. What's fascinating is that Louis actually recovered well from most of these interventions, not because they worked, but because his physicians were careful enough not to kill him. But this success only encouraged more experiments, more elaborate treatments, more desperate attempts to unlock the secrets of longevity and vitality. The king lived longer than many of his contemporaries. His advisors interpreted as validation of their methods. In reality, Louis XIV was just lucky, and his luck became proof of concept, became the template that other monarchs followed. And it created a situation where physicians competed to develop increasingly exotic and dangerous treatments because the reward for success, royal favor, wealth, status was so immense that it justified any risk. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of royal experimentation is how it normalizes suffering as a necessary component of progress. When a king's experiment causes pain or death, it's tragic, but it's also presented as a necessary cost of discovery. The subjects aren't victims, sacrifices on the altar of advancement. Their suffering has meaning. Their deaths serve a purpose. Psychological framework: the belief that some people's suffering is justified if it serves the greater good. is perhaps the most dangerous legacy of royal experimentation, because it doesn't die with the age of absolute monarchy. It persists in modern society. We see it in how industrial nations have conducted medical experiments on marginalized populations. We see it in how governments justify surveillance and control as necessary for security. We see it in how corporations harvest data and manipulate behavior in the name of innovation. Historical record shows us that unchecked power inevitably leads to experimentation on vulnerable populations. Also shows us something equally important. These experiments only continued because nobody with power chose to stop them. There was no resistance movement for the infants in Frederick II's isolation chambers. There were no protests against Charles II's medical torment. There was no public outcry that forced change. The systems that enabled these atrocities were ultimately brought down not by moral awakening from the ruling class, but by the rise of democratic institutions, legal frameworks, and public accountability. In other words, only thing that stopped royal experimentation was the removal of absolute power. This is information that goes much deeper into the systems that enabled these horrors, the political structures, the philosophical justifications, and the key figures who ultimately resisted them. You'll find all of that in the description and in the pinned comment, where we've compiled resources that trace the evolution from absolute monarchy to democratic governance, how that shift fundamentally changed what was possible. Because understanding that shift is crucial to understanding what we face today. We like to believe we've evolved beyond the age of royal experimentation, but we haven't. We've just created new systems with new names. Corporate experimentation on unwilling subjects. We have state surveillance programs justified as necessary for security. Pharmaceutical trials conducted on prisoners and the mentally ill. We have AI systems being trained on human data without consent. The names have changed. The justifications sound more scientific, more democratic, more reasonable. But the underlying pattern remains the same. People with power deciding that some people's rights and autonomy are acceptable costs of progress. The royal experiments we've examined tonight were conducted under the banner of curiosity and progress. The monarchs who ordered them believed, or at least claimed to believe, that the advancement of human knowledge justified the suffering of a few. That logic didn't die with absolute monarchy. It simply evolved into something more insidious. A logic that hides itself behind institutional credibility, peer review, and the promise that we're all working towards something greater. 1930s and 1940s, American and European governments weren't conducting experiments ordered by kings. They were conducting them in the name of science, public health, and national interest. The Tuskegee syphilis study followed African American men for 40 years without their informed consent, telling them they were receiving free medical care when in reality they were subjects in a study designed to observe the natural progression. Untreated syphilis. The men weren't treated even after penicillin became available. They died. Their families died. The justification was always the same. Medical progress requires sacrifice. Guatemala's government, the knowledge and participation of American medical researchers, deliberately infected thousands of people, prisoners, mental patients, soldiers, orphans, with sexually transmitted diseases between 1946 and 1948. The goal was to test whether penicillin could prevent infection. Weren't volunteers. These weren't patients who understood what was happening. They were people deemed expendable by those in power. When the truth emerged decades later, there was an apology. There were settlements. But the pattern had already been established. It is optional when the people conducting the experiment have power and the people being experimented on don't. Difference between King Frederick II's suspended children and modern human experimentation isn't the violation itself. It's the bureaucracy that surrounds it. A king could order an experiment and it was instantly undeniably his responsibility. A modern institution can conduct an experiment across multiple departments, multiple agencies, multiple layers of approval. Suddenly, no single person is accountable. The responsibility dissolves into process, into protocol, to the comfortable fiction that if it was approved by a committee, it couldn't have been truly wrong. Here's what truly connects these centuries of horror: the underlying assumption that some humans matter less. their suffering is an acceptable price, that their autonomy, their right to choose what happens to their own body, is negotiable. When King Frederick conducted his language deprivation experiment, he was operating under the assumption that peasant children's welfare was less important than satisfying royal curiosity. When American researchers infected Guatemalan prisoners with disease, they were operating under the assumption that those prisoners' lives were worth less than the data they could provide. When pharmaceutical companies conduct trials on incarcerated populations today, offering them reduced sentences or small payments in exchange for testing experimental drugs, they're operating under the same assumption. Desperation and powerlessness make someone available for use. The castle walls have been torn down. The thrones have been deposed. The castle itself, the structure of power, the hierarchy that places certain humans above others, assumption that progress justifies exploitation. That structure remains intact. We've just built modern buildings on its foundation and pretended there's something different. What makes this pattern so insidious now is that we've democratized the justification. It's no longer the whim of a single mad king. It's policy, law. It's necessary. It's ethical because it was reviewed. It's acceptable because someone consented, if that consent came from desperation. The cruelty has become systemic. Systemic cruelty is the hardest to see because it doesn't require anyone to be intentionally cruel. It just requires everyone to be complicit. The question you should be asking yourself right now is simple. Where is this happening today? Not in some imagined future. Not in some distant country you can safely judge from afar. Right now, in your country, in your medical system, in the research institutions that receive public funding, in the prisons justified as necessary, the pharmaceutical trials that always seem to target the poor and desperate, the AI systems being trained on your data without your meaningful consent, in the surveillance programs that monitor you in the name of security. The royal experiments of history weren't aberrations, they were previews. They showed us how those in power think about those without it, revealed the logic that justifies using humans as means rather than ends, and that logic hasn't disappeared, it's become ubiquitous, embedded in every institution that claims to be working for your benefit. This is why understanding history matters, because we can point at dead kings and feel superior, but because recognizing the pattern, the structure beneath different names and justifications is the only way to resist it. Every time someone in authority tells you that a violation of human rights is necessary for progress, remember Frederick II's children. Remember the subjects of the Tuskegee study. Remember the Guatemalan prisoners. Remember every person whose autonomy was sacrificed on the altar of someone else's ambition. Progress doesn't require your suffering. Innovation doesn't require your exploitation. Knowledge doesn't demand your consent be overridden. When anyone, a king, a researcher, a company, a government, tells you otherwise, they're speaking from the same throne of horrors that has stood for centuries. They've just used a different architectural style. The throne remains, we've just stopped noticing it because we've become accustomed to sitting on bench beneath it. Thank you for descending into this darkness with me. If you want to go deeper into how these patterns continue today and what resistance actually looks like, check the description and the pinned comment. There's a comprehensive resource that connects historical experimentation to modern systems of control. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us